Good afternoon, Brienne. This is the long-promised video or video presentation on Abigail Powers Filmore. And the picture that you're seeing as you hear this will make perfect sense to you in a few minutes. And I'm excited to talk to you about Abigail fondly. I think she is such an interesting lady. And even though her husband, the 13th President of the United States, Millard Fillmore, is probably remembered as one of the most forgettable of all of our presidents, her contribution endures today, and we want to talk a little bit about that. With the death of President Zachary Taylor, the office fell into the hands of Millard Fillmore, who I think probably is best known as being a I think he's a difficult president who sort of slid into the role, another accidental president. He was very considered to be very handsome. He was very tall for the age. He was over 6 feet tall, and educated, fairly well educated, I think. There's a lot of unknowns about him simply because he was in the shadow of a president who died early in office. As I think I've suggested to you before, this era of the American presidency is singularly forgettable, is undynamic, uncharismatic. You know, you've really got a period of time going from Martin Van Buren up through Buchanan where, and to be honest with you, it's very difficult for me to rattle those off in terms of chronology the way I do the other eras, and it's simply because they all run together. They are overshadowed by other issues and other personalities. So once you get post Jackson up to Lincoln, you have sort of like who was president then? So in any case, let me talk a little bit, having said that, let me talk a little bit about Abigail and her interesting background, and we will look at her through a different lens. Abigail was the daughter of a Baptist minister, no less, and she grew up in a religious home. And I think, gosh, I want to be careful what I say. Her father died when Abigail was quite young, and there were a lot of children, and she lived in terrible poverty. And we're going to talk about how her family came to make ends meet. But I want to say this. Her husband, Millard, was also from the most humble of financial backgrounds. And both of them, acquired education through phenomenal means. They loved learning, loved books, and loved reading. And I think that drove them as much as anything else in some of the things that they did. Unfortunately, Millard, and I don't know about his early religious background, but he became a Unitarian. And Unitarianism is something I don't understand. They have a real wonky view of both Scripture and of the Trinity. And it became almost a fashionable religion. And I read in a source I'm not real sure that I want to put a lot of stock in, but that Unitarianism became a fashionable religion for those who valued education and valued learning. And I'm going to go off the deep end here. I see today some people who are Christians who will reject some scripture because they think it questions their intellect. I believe personally in young earth creationism because I take scripture at its word. And I don't want to look at the 6 days of creation as some kind of literary model so that we could understand. I take it as literal. I take it literally. I know fine Christians who reject the 6 days and accept evolution or accept other explanations because of their educational training. So I think Unitarianism during the 19th century, later 18th, early 19th century, was a religious movement that was embraced by those who may have had some Christian leanings or Christian upbringing, but they didn't want to be considered old school or old-fashioned. They wanted to be considered up and coming. So that's something you can talk to your husband about, or talk to some of your professors in Christian studies, because they'll have a better sense of that than I do. I'm just coming at it from a historian's viewpoint. But I will say, if you want to understand Abigail, is she loved books, and she loved reading, and she loved literature in particular. So let's talk a little bit about her early life. She was the daughter of, as I told you, a Baptist minister named Lemuel Powers. Her father died when she was very, very young, and her mother, she was the youngest of 7 children. There are some other stepchildren that are going to come into the picture. Her mother is going to educate the children through the most difficult of circumstances. At 16, Abigail herself becomes a teacher in a school that her mother establishes. And the school was called the New Hope Academy. And in this little school, Abigail not only teaches, but she and her mother and siblings establish the first lending library where they lived in their county in New York State. And what's interesting is Millard, who grew up in very similar impoverishment, will attend school there at the New Hope Academy, and some sources will say that she even acted as an instructor in some of his courses. And I have a real hard time believing that on face value, because women would not have been in a situation where they would have instructed men. But who knows what it was like on the New York frontier at that point. But we do believe unquestionably that he checked out books from the library where she worked and the one she operated, and from that point on, they will establish a relationship. And I think they shared a love for learning and a love for books. He will establish for himself his own very successful law practice. And they date for, as we say today, they have an understanding for 7 years before they have the finances that they need to marry. And this is something I think we can't relate to today, is you don't get married until you can afford it. We'll see that with the Trumans. But he builds this successful law practice, and will also start a successful business career. So, I'm sorry, a successful political career. And he's a course in himself. I think he's kind of an interesting character. When he eventually works his way up to being President Taylor's vice president, and when Taylor dies, she becomes the mistress of the White House, the First Lady. And when she gets to the White House as a resident, she is appalled to find that there were virtually no books in the White House. And she immediately began a campaign to stock the White House with its own permanent literary treasury. And she is not successful at first. They are Whigs, the political party of Whigs, and Congress is predominantly populated by Democrats, so they're not in a big hurry to give her a whole lot of money for what she asked. But she's charming and very likable, and she finally wins their hearts, and she will donate monies. They will donate monies, give her monies, in addition to particular books, to start this project. She will be given books by the great authors of this era, Dickens, Hawthorne, and Washington Irving, and then she will also be given a complete set of bound congressional documents. She will place these books in a beautiful yellow office, or it's called a yellow oval room. I don't want to say Oval Office because it's not the Oval Office, but this room has remained traditionally yellow over the years, as the White House is refurbished, and this will become really the first of the presidential libraries, and I believe that it becomes a how do I want to say, a working and permanent example of the importance of personal presidential libraries. So, a president having his papers and things accessible. So, as you know, presidents have their libraries today. I've been to the Carter Center. I think I've mentioned that to you, and so uh, they just become repositories for the president's personal papers, and um, I think you really get the ball rolling here. Dr. Justice would know more about, he knows where every one of those thinkers are. But I think you get the ball rolling here, even though we're dealing with a permanent part of the residency versus something that goes with the president, but just the idea that he should be represented by the books of his era and his papers. So, in any case, this is a beautiful room, as you see, and it became not only a repository for great books during her short term in the White House, but it also became a place where there was entertaining and music in particular. Abigail and Millard had two children, a son, Abigail Filmore Sr., or Jr. rather, and then a lovely daughter named Mary Abigail. And Mary was a harpist and a pianist, and her mother was a pianist, and the library became not only a library for entertaining, but it also became a music room. And Mary, because Abigail's health was pretty fragile at this point, um, Mary will take over as the primary hostess during her father's brief time in the White House. And so I think this is one of those forgotten bits of information is how she's going to establish sort of this precedent of books and reading, and the established precedent of creating presidential libraries. Trying to think what else I want to tell you. Millard Fillmore wisely did not run for a second term for the presidency, and sadly, you and I have talked about the Pierces. Because Mrs. Pierce could not attend the inauguration when Franklin is elected, Mrs. Fillmore attends, and it's cold, windy, and wet. Her fragile health is damaged by this, and she will acquire pneumonia because she's out there, and die before she's able to return home. And that just breaks my heart. It breaks my heart. Millard will remarry within 5 years. He remarries a woman named Caroline Carmichael, and she is problematic at best. They seem to have had a happy, if not short, marriage. It was her second marriage also, but she's kind of a mess, and her mental health deteriorates during the presidency and after. During their time together, and then afterwards. And she was never accepted by the children, and as a matter of fact, there's some squabbling over their father's assets, which is kind of sad. It really is sad. So Mrs. Filmore, the first Mrs. Filmore, is someone in danger, I think, of being forgotten by history when she actually created, a place of beauty and reinvigorated the White House as a place of learning and valued education and the keeping of books and papers. I do want to tell you that during I've got to be so careful with this because I was sort of skeptical. During her time in the White House, she did have some high profile visitors. Jenny Lind, who you may have heard of, actress, a singer, and William Makepeace Thackeray, a British author. He wrote Vanity Fair. And I will tell you that I have watched a British production of Vanity Fair, and it's such a story. I don't know that I would recommend it because it's certainly a look at human behavior, but it's very heartbreaking at the same time. A couple of sources have claimed that Dickens was actually there, and I don't think so. Dickens comes to the country in 1842, and he comes again after the American Civil War. And there are a couple of different presidents who claim that he was there at the White House, and it doesn't fit on the timeline that he was there during the Filmore years. P.T. Barnum was, Thackeray was, Jenny Lind was, but I don't think Dickens was actually there. Now, she had plenty of Dickens writings there. She may have had some readings there, but if you find something different, you let me know about that. But I don't think that he was actually there at the Filmore White House. So what do we take away again from Mrs. Filmore is a devoted family woman from a terribly difficult background. She's considered to have been the poorest of the first ladies up to this point. And in terms of her how she grew up in a Christian home, and she grew up in a home where, despite their poverty, they loved learning, and she will share that love of learning and arts, and try to make the White House a place of that. It would be interesting to look, if we had time. It would be interesting to look at each of the first ladies to see what did they actually bring. I know they all have causes and things, that they're interested in, but what did they actually bring to the culture of the White House? Here you have reading and music again. You had that with Louisa, of course, and then Lucy Hayes, not only the temperance, but the time she spent with young people and showing them that they could do things and have a great time without the worldliness, the contributing of the flowers to the White House and to the hospitals. So it would be really interesting to look at each of the first ladies and not think about them just in terms of a hostess, but think about what they actually brought to the White House. So this has been short and sweet, and I promised her for a long time. Sorry it took me so long to get there, but I hope to talk to you in the next day or so, hopefully this afternoon, about we're going to look at Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft and their spouses. So thank you, and appreciate your interest, and I hope you're having a good day. Bye, honey.